thank you so much, Jonathan, for that wonderful response. Okay, in our now storied tradition, I will take three or four questions and then give it over to the three of you to respond. Okay? Yes, Diana.
So thank you for this wonderful panel. I have a question for Jen about the stuff of dictatorship. Can you speak a little bit to the relationship between nationalist chic, which is retrospective, and totalitarian kitsch, which is produced in its own time?
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was going to ask this question anyway, but John's conclusion makes it more relevant because you were saying maybe there's something new here. I've always seen, at least Nazism, which is my area of specialization, as wanting to be popular and modern so badly that, with the exception of maybe the Jews, they were always conflicted about whether they could really marginalize any group. Whether you read Tim Mason or Ian Kershaw, Catholics, workers, prostitutes, there's always this malleability on the part of fascism where, while they have the own the libs side to make conservatives happy, they can't really hold to it in a doctrinaire way, right? They always want the support of, gays for Trump, single women for Hitler, right? So I'm wondering really if there's anything new about this. If the Third Reich was so populist and so desperate for support and kind of validation in a post-democratic society that they did some of the same thing, right? And then every ordinary Germans could find ways in which, oh, well, I'm accepted and these people aren't, which is kind of what Jen's point is, right? If you're on the inside, even Jews at times said, oh, maybe I can be accepted now. And fascism does that in a way that traditional conservatism doesn't. And I think that's a continuity. I just wanted to ask both of you about that.
Alyssa?
Yeah, thank you for this fantastic panel. I wanted to circle back to the popular post-fascism of the 1970s. And I think it's very interesting that Bowie qualifies Hitler as a rock star, which actually I think there is something interesting in that. And Jagger posing with Leni Riefenstahl, but what Vidal just did, claiming that Hitler was a communist, is something totally different. And I think I just wanted to get your thought on that, because I think as historians we might think it's utterly stupid and incorrect, but as a very erratic and catchy argument, it's very persuasive, because it wipes away the accusation that the AfD is illiberal. Illiberal in a political sense, as we accuse it, but so they underscore that they are liberal in an economic sense. So I think it's an interesting way of arguing, and it's maybe not as stupid as we might think. And I was wondering also with Amy yesterday that there is a book I really like of a war reporter, Chris Hedges, published in 2002. War is a force that gives us meaning. And I think in this kind of activism, fascism as activism, is also fascism can be a force that gives us meaning. And I think this meaning making, not maybe in a theological, religious sense, but also in a sense of like affects, action. And I really like Mary to underscore that there is, gender is kind of always minimized when we talk about economics. And actually yesterday in the panel on war and violence, I missed that a little bit, because I think we talked a little bit, but not enough, that there are studies by Pamela Sweat or Eve Rosenthal saying that actually all this 1920s activism of the SA, or this radicalization of the unemployed man in Wedding and other working class districts, has also to do that men were unemployed and was passed their time in a pub and drinking, politicizing, while their women had to do family, a double shift family, and working for a lower wage at the factories. So I think there are gender analyses that are not mentioned enough.
Diana, yeah, this is such an interesting question. Nationalist chic viewed in retrospective versus totalitarian kitsch produced in its own time. And it reminds me of the conversation we had yesterday, I think, about when minority populations use hegemonic symbols, but reclaim them and reinvest them in their own way as a strategy, right? And I think that that's obviously the big difference in this case, right? It's about defanging the symbols, at the same time reinvesting them with their own energy, with their own, desires. And this gets back to this idea of viewing fascism as not something that's purely negative in that sense, but that is productive in generating new meanings and new forces. And this kind of speaks to Alyssa's point too about the work that fascism or fascist aesthetics does. And it's one of the reasons why, and I'm not out there saying like, super hardcore pornography, yay, and, Susan Sontag, no. I mean, I'm trying to get us to think about the work, like John said, right? What did you say? The service of ideas, concepts like fascism, and in this case, I'd say aesthetics, the service that the aesthetics of fascism, what work it actually does for certain populations in those moments. So that's kind of, for me, what is interesting about this tension.
I would just add one small point to Eric Kurlander's point, which is it came up earlier in this conference that there was also this moment a few years ago where in like this at the same time, Caitlyn Jenner and Kanye West had also like both endorsed Trump. And these are just things that seem to like frazzle the minds of liberals, right? Like how could it be? But we're seeing it over and over again, that there is a kind of ecumenicism to this populism that seems to be, cutting across all familiar lines. And we're seeing that also with the realignment of the parties, right? So I think we're kind of just without a map right now. Yep.
Can I respond
yes,
briefly?
Sorry.
I think there is, to Eric's question, I think there is a division on the right about whether you're going to try to co-opt groups in that may seem unlikely candidates to be part, like gays, and those who really are hardcore disciplinarian. We will jail women who have abortions and jail doctors who provide them. We don't care about that segment of women. Or, legal scholars like Adrian Vermeulen, who says, we will force people to lead off. We're not going to try to win them over and persuade them. We believe in our morality, and we want to impose it in a very authoritarian way. And how that is going to play out, I think, remains to be seen. And I think with the massive attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion, they have written off a whole lot of people who are going to be very negatively influenced by that as simply not worth trying to court. If you're willing to change your views, fine, otherwise not. As to, Vidal calling Hitler a communist, I think the accusations of communism and socialism have become totally free-floating on the right. It's simply somebody you don't like, you say you're a socialist or you're a communist, in the same way that on the left so often fascism is used simply to say, I don't like something the right is doing. I don't like some people, without any analytic meaning, which is why I have long argued fascism is a really good concept to think with, but I'm very wary of the label because it short-circuits analysis.
Okay, so yes, and then Tina, and then Brett.
Thank you very much for the discussion. It's for all of you, also for the public, but Jennifer in particular. And I really need your insight in understanding 3 movies that came out in Italy, maybe 4. And that starts with The Dam, La caduta del D-Day of Visconti, and then there is Il conformista of Bertolucci, Night Porter, and then Salò. There is a representation of fascism by directors in which they would not blame homosexuality. It is very central. That is one of the most, I would say, not understandable structure of understanding fascism. Because certainly for Pasolini, Salò became a kind of death or warrant, precisely for the depiction of fascism as a kind of morbid deviation. And I was wondering, thanks to your thoughts, if the paradigm that they were working on, and that it was completely detached from their own being homosexual. Liliana Cavani was a woman, but she was reading through also the reproduction of documentary on women within the movies. Why they chose this paradigm, and you mentioned to a certain point of your response, anti-fascism. So how do you place in this model in which fascism is treated in the 70s like a kind of, I would say, reactionary, punishing way in which representing heterosexuality but also homosexuality? I would say the trilogy of Visconti goes on there with Helmut Berger, this kind of ambiguity. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, there's so much, it's hard to know where to start. So just two things. One is, I mean, I'm still fixated on the 70s and sort of bleeding into the 80s in that, I mean, I'm wondering whether it's useful for us to really go back to this moment of thinking. I mean, this is the US, right? The moral majority, the pro-family movement. The silent majority. I mean, that was in many ways, the threat of that right-wing moral majority in a response to second wave feminism, in response to the movements of the 60s, was also very much what pushed feminism forward, right? And we did formulate a response, right? And we did, in some ways, overcome certain parts of that Reagan revolution that then was the result of mobilizing the moral majority and other pieces that have just never gone away. So I'd love to sort of, push more on again, thinking about the 70s and that there was, there really was a powerful movement that used a lot of the same ideas and concepts, although the trans was not as much present, but certainly gay and feminism and reproductive rights and all of those issues. So that's one thing. And then very quickly, the second is that, and this is a more general question that came up for me listening to all three of you and then sort of gelled with what Molly was saying, is that there does seem to be this peculiar way in which now that as with fascism, our, whatever we want to call it, right, that movement that is bringing together all of this right-wing populist, quote-unquote fascist energy, has the ability to mobilize electoral politics, right? I mean, they have the ability to bring out voters to the polls and people actually vote, and that's how they gain power, right? Whereas the quote-unquote left, right, with all of its weird range from, sort of what is seen as really kind of out there, from deviant to exciting, right, to left, to these left liberals that we are so upset about because of their weakness, that we have not been able to forge those alliances that actually get people to vote, and a lot of, the people who are, well, that's a question. It seems to me that a lot of the folks who are really being targeted are not being mobilized, into electoral politics. If anything, it's this alienation. But the right is able to do it, and so that's, and historically we can think about that too. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, I'm gonna let you talk, and then we're out of town.
Yeah, we're out of time.
Yeah, okay, so can you just ask this question?
I want to respond to Jennifer's bringing up Anti-Oedipus, because I was in one of those reading groups in the 1970s. We didn't have enough of the eyewitness accounts, and as a moment of sort of fluidity, because this was really sort of experimental thinking, and And so one thing is sort of from a historical perspective, sort of the genealogy of these moments and also the genealogy of the feelings associated with it, and that there's a certain periodization in this, because as Tina was saying, this was connecting to the 1920s and 30s. I mean, Wilhelm Reich, I was living with the people from the Malve Verlag in Berlin, and Peter Genter was one of the republishers of Wilhelm Reich's Massenpsychologie. But on the other hand, these were also people who, in their own personal history, carried the Nazi past. You know, Peter's father was a judge in Nazi Germany, and Heidi Palis's father was in the Waffen-SS, and so it all sort of comes haunting back, you know, and so in that sense, but it was this moment when it was a reaction also against this sort of more rigidifying Marxist, post-Marxist movements, and we were this sort of, you know, the against, for everything, against everything movement, and that was kind of a turning point.
Unfortunately, we can't have you respond, so I encourage one-on-one conversations at the front of the room, with my apologies to those like Rick who were not able to ask questions. Please come and have that interaction.